I want to continue the lessons we've been reading or studying about reading through the Bible. I'm doing this to encourage you to do that. And you don't have to start in Genesis. If you want to, just start in Joshua. We're going to start with Joshua tonight. But about reading the Bible through, all the different methods, the one I've used the most is just start in Genesis and read through to Revelation. And I get the title I have for this set of lessons here is What to Expect When You Read the Bible Through. I want you to expect to be able to understand it. Now, there'll be a lot of things in there you may not understand. Well, why is that told? Or maybe there'll be parts that, well, I just don't understand that piece there. But overall, you're going to understand what you're reading. And so don't let the difficult portions discourage you from gaining what you can get out of the easier portions to read. And the Bible starts off very easy to read, talking about the beginning, talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you talk about the history of Israel and how they become a nation. And then you start getting into the diverse laws and ordinances. Tonight, you're going to see one of the reasons it's important to read those. That is usually not as intriguing a reading. And you wonder, well, why would the Lord have them do these certain things? I won't go back over that because we talked about that. But, you know, there's different levels of knowledge that you have. I remember when we were in training, there was a awareness knowledge. And then there was I think they had it to 3 or 4 levels. If I can remember, one was awareness. One is perform with supervision. Finally, you're able to perform without supervision. And then you're able to instruct others. You know, you're able to supervise others as they perform. And so there's different kind of levels of knowledge. What you need is at least an awareness of everything in the Bible. It doesn't mean you're going to be thoroughly acquainted with it. There's parts of the Bible you need to have a very thorough understanding of, and it's much more important than other parts. But of all the parts, you need at least an awareness, and you'll get that by reading through it. So plow your way through those diverse laws and ordinances and all the instructions about the sacrifices and the priest and when they were supposed to do that and the feast days and the calendar days and read on through that. And there'll be little snippets in between there that'll be very interesting. And it'll remind you maybe of things you've heard otherwise along the way. And then you'll come to the end of Deuteronomy. Now, I remember memorizing the books of the Old Testament. And I'm glad, so I don't remember when I did that. It seems like I've always known the books of the Bible. I must have been very young when they were teaching me how to memorize the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament. But you can remember easy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I mean, that's not too hard to learn. And then the next 3 books, I remember learning that by saying, then I come to my little sentence. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. It's like, you know, Joshua is the, what do you call it, the subject. And then Judges, that's the action, and Ruth is the direct object. You know, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, like a little sentence. Well, now that's not what happened, and that's not how it occurred, but that's just what I thought we'd think of when I was going through reading those Bibles. Let's talk about Joshua, Judges, and Ruth tonight. And there's a lot of thrilling stories in there. I tell you, boys love the stories in Joshua, Judges, and somewhat in Ruth. You can make Ruth interesting to boys. Now, a lot of times the girls really like the story of Ruth, but there's a lot of interesting stories. You know, I remember back when I was a young boy, I don't know if people do this anymore. I don't see them like I used to. Used to, you could get comic books about superheroes. And you'd read about all these superheroes and the feats they did, and we'd buy these comic books. And then I remember learning Joshua, Judges, those stories, and I thought, well, that's better than those comic books. You know, the feats and the stories that you hear, and they're real stories. Here's what's happened. Moses has died. And before Moses died, he said, there'll come a prophet like unto me, unto him shall you hearken. And Joshua then comes in to take the place of Moses. Now Joshua is not that prophet. That's going to be a prophet to come later on. But Joshua had a very difficult leadership job, didn't he? I mean, he had a big task to accomplish in moving into the promised land and taking that land and dividing it out among all of the tribes. That itself would be a great job. But I'll tell you what made that job probably even more challenging. He had to follow Moses. Now, whenever you're looking at people and positions, I tell you, Moses did a good job. And you try to step in behind someone that just did a wonderful job, that can be a very intimidating task to do that. There's another thing, though. Joshua was a leader of these people during a time of transition. That is always a very difficult time to lead. Now, things are going along and you get one leader and he steps down and another and things are just kind of going as they are. You kind of have precedent to operate on. But to lead a people that have been a people wandering in the wilderness until people settled into a land and settled down. Now, that was a great task that he performed. I remember reading, and it's the statement that there's not a negative thing said about Joshua. And I think that's almost so. There is one time when Joshua was deceived by the Gibeonites. He's supposed to drive the people out of the land, and the Gibeonites come up to him, and they didn't live. They just lived just over the hill, but they came over and they made it look like they had been on a long, long journey, like they were far, far away. And they made a pact with Joshua, and Joshua was thinking, well, they live so far off, we wouldn't have to worry about them anyway. And then they march on over the hill, and there they are. So there's one time when he was deceived, so that would be a negative thing. But other than that, Joshua did a very remarkable job in his leadership. But now imagine if that was you. And you're going to have to take on this task. That would be a daunting task, wouldn't it? So the Lord came to Joshua and says in Joshua chapter 1, and I took excerpts from chapter 1 to put this together, but God told Joshua, as I was with Moses, I will be with thee. I will not fail thee or forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. Do according to all the law Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it, neither to the right hand or to the left, nor be afraid. For the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. And with that assurance, Joshua took command of the nation of Israel. Now, he sent spies into the land. 2 spies. And they go into Jericho. And they're spying out the land like Joshua had done himself when he was a much younger man. And Rahab hid them in her house. She had a house that was on the wall of the city. And when they came looking for those 2 spies, word got out that they were there. She went up on the roof and covered them with flax and hid them and sent the searchers that were looking for them out another way. And then when the coast was clear, she let them down out of a window to her house outside the city so they could run back and tell Joshua and get away. But before they left, she asked them, she said, will you spare me and my family? And those spies said, we'll do it. But here's what you have to do. You have to get in this house and bring your family into the house when we show up, and then hang a scarlet cord outside the window. And when we see that, we'll know where you are, and we'll get with Joshua and make sure that you are spared. So the spies come back to Joshua. Joshua's ready to go over into the promised land. But the Jordan River is now at flood stage. I don't see it too much around here, but every now and then when these creeks get up, you know, the whole bottom land is covered with water. And that's the way it would have been with the Jordan River down in that narrow valley. But that whole valley would have been covered with water. And you couldn't cross the Jordan River now when it's at flood stage. So, following God's commandments, Joshua told the priest, he says, you carry the ark. I'm going to gather all the people around, and before all the people, we're going to take the ark out of the tabernacle, and you just march right down there toward the river. And so the priests bore the ark on their shoulders, And they're marching down toward that river, and they get to the edge of that flood water, and as soon as their feet step where that flood waters are, the waters open up, and the nation of Israel is able to cross the Jordan River during flood stage on dry ground. Well, sounds like the Lord's keeping His promise, isn't it? As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. And so the people seeing that would have realized and had made that connection. On their way across, 12 men, one of each tribe, went out to the middle of that river while they were crossing and gathered up a huge stone. And they came on the other side of the river and they made a stone monument on the far side of the river so that their children in years to come would say, "What mean ye by these stones?" And their parents and grandparents could tell them what the Lord had done for them in bringing them across the Jordan River. Now they came and camped in a place called Gilgal. And at Gilgal, two things very important happened. One is they circumcised their sons. They had not done that in the wilderness as they should have done. And so before they go any further, they did this circumcision. Now that's somewhat of a debilitating thing, and you think you've just crossed right into the enemy territory, and now you're all debilitated like that. So it took faith to do what God wanted them to do, wasn't it? So they circumcised their males. And then the manna ceased. God said, from now on, you won't have the manna. You're going to live off of the fruit of the ground. Now they crossed the Jordan River right over against Jericho. And Joshua was looking at Jericho, and here's a little scene in the book of Joshua that's often overlooked, but I think it's one of the most interesting scenes in the book. It's in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said, Art thou for us or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord I am come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship and said, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoes from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Doesn't that remind you of Moses and the burning bush? And notice Joshua worshiped this soldier that was there. This was probably the one that would later come to us as the Christ, as Jesus Christ standing there. But I'm thinking of this. Here's Joshua. He's over in the enemy's line. He's looking at Jericho and he looks and there's this soldier. Now you know that must have been a powerful looking soldier, knowing who this is. And his sword is already drawn in his hand. And what does Joshua do? He walks over and says, Are you for us or against us? I mean, it sounds like old Joshua, look, if you're against us, I'll take you on right now, isn't it? And yet he finds out it's the captain of the Lord's host. Isn't that just an interesting scene that takes place here? And the captain tells Joshua how they're going to take Jericho. It's not like any battle plan you'd ever heard of. He said, I want you to take the people, and I want you to go march around the city of Jericho, and no one's to say anything. You walk all the way around the city, and then you come back to your camp. Now, don't do that one day. I want you to do that once a day for 6 days. And then the 7th day, I want you to march around the city of Jericho. Now, don't utter a peep. Don't say a word. I want you to do it 7 times. And then, after you've done it 7 times, all the people shout, and all the priests blow their trumpets, and you'll have Jericho. And that's what the people did. It's a great lesson on obedience. They went and did what the Lord said. And you often imagine, what must the citizens of Jericho thought about this? Here they come, and they're all ready for this battle, and there's no battle. They just walk quietly around and go back home. What was that? And they do it again and again and again and again and again and again. And then that day came, they just keep marching around and around. And then the walls came down. We've sung that song, Joshua fit the battle at Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. And they took that city, and just as they promised, they spared Rahab and her family. Great victory there as the entrance into the land and taking of the land. Must have had their confidence way up, because there's a little city not far from Jericho called Ai. And Joshua selected a few of his men, not a great army, but he sent a small army up there. Go take Ai. They go marching into Ai, and I'll tell you, that little city, while they were able to take the great city of Jericho, the little city of Ai defended itself against them and sent them back running. And Joshua's wondering, what has gone wrong here? Well, God told Joshua there's sin in the camp. You see, he had told them, now when you go to Jericho, everything you take is to be dedicated to the Lord. It's like the first fruits. But there's one fella, his name was Achan. And I'll tell you how I remember his name here in just a minute. Achan. He stole some garments that he thought were beautiful and went and buried and hid them in his tent. You know, that's just like a thief. Go out and steal something, and then you have to hide it, and you can't even enjoy it. You know, but that's what thieves do. Well, that's what Achan did. And because he had done this, God was not going to be with Israel till that was rectified. So they started drawing lots. And it came back down, and it got right down to where they identified Achan. And Joshua asked Achan, what have you done? And Achan explained it to him. And so they took Achan out, and they stoned him to death. I'll tell you how I remember that. I think about him being buried under that pile of rocks as they were stoning him, and figured he must have been aching. So I remember Achan, you know, he must have really been aching when that happened. So I remember the name of Achan that way. Now, Achan, that had been rectified, that sin that was in the camp. And so they go back after Ai, and the Lord told them, now do it this way. Send that same little army up there. Go up to the city of Ai like you're going to attack it, and when they come out, take off running like you did last time and let them chase you. But have the big army hanging around behind the city. And when the men leave the city of Ai, then you bring the big forces in and burn the city. And when you soldiers that have gone up to the front gates of Ai, when you see the city burn, turn on the men and slay them. And that's how they did it. They just tricked those men of Ai and got them out of their city. And as their city was burning, the army turned on them. They had them between the two armies, and they took the city of Ai. Well, word got out. We've got to stop these people. 5 kings of 5 major cities in the central part of the land got together and says, we'll fight them together with a mighty force. And they come out after to try to defeat Israel, and Joshua commands his armies, and the battle is raging along, and Israel is winning the battle. But the day is going on and the sun is going down, and Joshua doesn't want the nightfall to give those kings a chance to escape. And so Joshua prays that the sun and the moon would stand still. And God, to do that, the whole universe had to come to a halt, didn't it? Because we know how that the motions of the planets and all, somehow God in his might made the sun and the moon to stand still and prolong the day while Israel finished up the job in defeating the kings in the central portion of that land. And then it talks about a southern campaign that they took and went down and took Hebron. And that's kind of interesting because you remember Caleb? Old Caleb. He was with Joshua. Joshua and Caleb were the 2 spies that had come back and said, we can take the land. When the Israel didn't believe them, they had to wander 40 years in the wilderness. Now Joshua and Caleb are old men. And old Caleb, when they make that southern campaign, he goes to see his old comrade Joshua. And they had been to the city of Hebron. That was the walled city and the city of giants. Old Caleb says, Joshua, give me that mountain. And so old Caleb, he went out. He's the one that was able to take the city of Hebron and was able to dwell in that very area where they had harvested those great grapes, you know, where the men couldn't carry them by themselves and said that we were like ants before them. Caleb wound up being the one taking that when he was an old man. Had help from his son-in-law Othniel, if you read about that. It's a good story. Well, they had taken the land, then they made a northern campaign. Joshua 13, verses 1 through 7. And verses 1, and then I'm going to read a little bit of verse 7. Joshua 13. Now Joshua was old and stricken in years. And the Lord said unto him, Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance unto the 9 tribes. They hadn't taken it all yet. There were still a lot of the enemies to drive out, but Joshua's getting old. And God told Joshua, you need to be an administrator now rather than an army general, and you divide that land. And so then, as you're reading the Bible through, you come to this part, and it's like reading surveys. Sometimes get out your survey. Get out the survey of your property, or find an old survey, and you'll read how they go so far to this mark and so far to that mark, and then over here to that. And they lay out the land, and some of the old surveys would identify the landmarks along the way. And that's what happens here with cities and landmarks and rivers and things. And so you read, when you read, you're going to read these surveys as Joshua divides the land of Canaan out among those 12 tribes so that they'll have a place where they can settle. And that's what Joshua did. It says to the 9 tribes, there's 9.5 tribes, because 2 of the tribes and a half tribe was going to get land on the far side of Jordan, and then the 9.5 on this side. And so again, it's not the most exciting part to read, but if you like to read old surveys, it's kind of interesting to see how they documented that, and the people were to have that land for that tribe and their inheritance forever on that portion there. So there's the 12 tribes of Israel settling in the land. Now, I come to Joshua chapter 24. And I want to read some verses toward the end of Joshua. Verse 14. Joshua gathers the people to him and says, Behold, this day I'm going the way of all the earth. That's how he described his impending death. I'm going the way of all the earth. And you know, in all your hearts and in all your souls, there hath not one thing failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, not one thing hath failed thereof. One of the great lessons of the book of Joshua is God keeps his promises. He had promised Abraham that his seed would have this land, and everything God promised had come to pass in regard to them having that land. Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15. Next chapter. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your fathers served which were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And then, going on to end the story of Joshua, you read on into the next book, the book of Judges. I hear you turning in your Bibles, and that's wonderful. Turn to Judges chapter 2. Let me read a great compliment to Joshua in Judges chapter 2. I'm going to begin reading in verse 6. And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man into his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance, in the Timnath-heres, in the mount of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill Nash. Also all that generation were gathered to their fathers. Oh, it'd been great if the story ended right there, but there's one more line here. And there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. All of Joshua's generation and all the days of all the elders that outlived Joshua had served the Lord, but this new generation came on. They did not listen to their parents. They did not learn from the generations that went before them. And it started up a cycle here. Here's what the people would do. They would sin against the Lord. They would actually start worshiping the gods of the land, of the Amorites and the Canaanites where they dwelt. God would become angry with them, and He would bring up another people to oppress them. And in their oppression, they would repent, and they would turn to the Lord. And the Lord would raise up a deliverer that is called a judge in the book of Judges, and he would deliver the people from that captivity and that oppression, and they would prosper and serve the Lord again. But this cycle would repeat over and over and over and over through the book of Judges. Now, the thing is, several things in the book of Judges are taking place at the same time, and you kind of got to remember that when you look at the chronology. I mean, they may be prospering here in this part of the land while they're sinning in this part of the land, and the armies are coming and going at different stages. So some of these stories begin to overlap just a little bit. But basically, that's the story of the book of Judges, this cyclic nature of things that are taking place. And there's great stories to tell about those judges, those heroes that God raised up to deliver Israel. Othniel. What they did, God raised up Cusham-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. He oppressed Israel for 8 years until Othniel, that's Caleb's son-in-law, Othniel delivered the people from the Mesopotamians. And then we read about this judge named Ehud. Now here's an interesting story. Ehud was left-handed. Now, if you were right-handed and you had a little sword, you'd keep it on your left side, see, because we want to be able to be quick on the draw, you'd grab that sword. Well, Ehud, being left-handed, kept his sword on the right side. Eglon, the king of Moab, had come up to oppress the land. And let me tell you about Eglon. He was fat. I mean, he's probably the fattest man you're going to read about in all the Bible. He had a great big belly. And so Ehud comes up and he tells the folks, he says, look, I've got a message for Eglon. Well, these guys search him, but they're not any much better than some of these guys at church in the airport, you know, when things just keep getting through. They searched him, but they searched this side for his sword, but he'd been left-handed. He had his sword on this side, and they missed it. He walked in there with the sword, and he says, I've got a message for the king, and I've got to tell you this in secret. So big old fat king, he sent all the people out. And so it's just he and Ehud in there, and Ehud walks up like he's going to whisper something in the ear of the king, and he reaches over the left and pulls that sword, and he rams it right into that big fat-bellied king. And he was so fat that he lost his sword. I mean, it went in, and it said the fat closed in around it, and he couldn't pull his sword out. And it gets in detail. It even says the dirt came out. I mean, this must have been a horrible thing that took place. And Eglon, he did not survive that. I mean, he went down, and he was dead. And so Ehud goes out the door, and he locks the door behind him. And he walks out, and he tells the guards, you know, these guards that didn't know how to search him, they must not have been very bright. He told them, he said, look, he's laying down, and he doesn't need to be disturbed. And so he left. And so they just stood out there for the longest time while Ehud went out, and he got the army up. Finally, they thought that, you know, he has sure been resting a long time, and they got embarrassed. And they got through the door, and they looked in. Of course, their king was dead. And when they find out, here comes Israel's army, and they drove out those people there. See, that's the kind of story you're going to read. You read about Shamgar. There's really, I just think, one verse about Shamgar. When I think of Shamgar, I think of a country boy, because the weapon he used was an ox goad. Now, what that is, see, when they'd come in and take the country, they'd try to take all the weapons away from everybody, so they wouldn't have swords and spears and bows and arrows. They'd try to confiscate all that, but they'd leave them with their farming implements, and he had an ox goad. Now, an ox goad, that's what you'd prod the oxen along with to make the ox away, so it'd be a long, sharp stick out there that you could kind of prod the oxen. And he said, that'll be my weapon. And he kind of reminds me of what Samson's going to do later. He took an ox goad, and how many was it that he slew? I think he slew, was it 300 or 600? 600 Philistines that he slew. Well, now, they're all decked out in all their armor and swords and everything. And this old country boy comes out here with this ox goad, and he's able to defeat 600 of them to relieve Israel from that oppression. You read about Deborah and Barak. Deborah, who is a woman judge. Now, she doesn't take leadership roles. She takes a teaching and supportive role. For leadership, she turned to Barak. And she told Barak, Barak, you drive the enemies out of the land. Here's Sisera here with all his armies. You got to drive him out of the land. And Barak says, well, I'll do it, but I want you to go with me. And Barak is usually criticized for that because Deborah said, I'll go with you, but the glory of the battle will be given to a woman. I don't know that Barak deserves too much criticism. I tell you, there's some things that I don't want to do without my wife at my side. Now, she wasn't married to him, but she did represent the Lord. He wanted to make sure she was there with him as he did this, and he didn't feel capable on his own, so he knew to ask for help. Well, anyway, they did that. And the battle waxed sore against Sisera, and so Sisera fled from his army. He was the general, and he ran away from his army while they were being defeated. And while he was running away, he passed this tent, and there's this woman at the door of the tent. And she beckons to Sisera, come on into the tent. Says, you rest in here, I'll feed you and help you recover your strength so you can get on your way. In the song about it says she brought him butter in a lordy dish. I mean, she was buttering him up, wasn't she? And butter, that's probably like a good yogurt or something to eat that he could enjoy. He filled up on that, and he was all wore out with battle, and he lay down on the floor of that tent to rest. And while he was resting, she went and took one of the tent pegs and came over and drove it through his temples, nailing him to the ground. And so she got the glory of the battle, like Deborah said. And then we read about Gideon, and you know the story about Gideon. He's out there at the threshing floor, and the Lord told him to deliver Israel. He says, well, I can't do this. Gideon didn't feel capable, but the Lord promised, I'll be with you, and showed Gideon signs to indicate that he would be with him. And so Gideon gathers up the army of Israel to go after the Midianites, and there's many of them. And his army is small, and the Lord says, you've got too many. You've got to send them home. Tell everybody that don't want to fight today, that are worried about, just go home. And a lot of them left. And he's left with a small army, and the Lord said, that's still too many. He says, have them go down and take a drink. And here's how you pick your soldiers. The ones that hold on to their swords and put their water in the stream and drink like this. Now, they're the ones to pick. But those that lay their weapons down and get down and drink like a dog would drink, you send them home. And when I found out at the end of the day he only had 300 men, he said, here's your weapon. Take a pitcher and put a torch in the pitcher and give everybody a horn. Well, with those weapons, they surrounded the Midianites up in the hills. And when the signal was given, they broke their pitchers so that in the darkness, all these lights showed up in the hills. And then they blew their horns, and the Midianites thought they were surrounded by a vast army, and they panicked. And in the darkness, they were fighting one another, and they were killing one another off while they're making all this racket up here in the hills. And finally, they in their panic, they fled, and Gideon took off after them with a small army, gathering others along the way, and was able to drive the enemy out of the land. Well, there's more Judges stories. I'm going to run out of time tonight, I think, but let me tell you about Samson. This is one of the longest stories of the Judges. Samson and the Philistines. Now, Samson is the strongest man in the Bible. He had superhuman strength. And the reason he had that was the Lord gave it to him. An angel had come to Samson's parents and told him they would have this son, and they weren't ever to cut his hair, and he was never to drink any wine, don't touch any grape. Listen, he doesn't even get to eat a raisin. So here's Samson. He's forbidden of all things that come from the vine, and his hair grows long and long and long. And even when he was a small boy, he began to show his great strength. Well, Samson had great physical strength, but I tell you, his moral character had some lacking, and he had a real weakness. And his weakness was women. And he had this girlfriend that was a Philistine woman over in Timnath. And he got his dad, he said, I want you to get her to me for a wife. Well, his daddy didn't want to do it. Says, son, she is a Philistine. That's our enemies. He said, I don't care. I love her. I want her for my wife. Well, he's out there going to see his girlfriend one day, going down the trail, and a lion comes out. And he grabs that lion, and he kills the lion with his bare hands. Throws him off on the side of the road and goes on and visits her and goes back home. A few days later, he's going down that road, and he looks over there where that dead lion is, and some bees had gotten in that lion. and had made some honey. And he reaches over there with his hand, sticks his hand in that honeycomb, gets honey all over his fingers, and he enjoys that honey. And then he goes sees his honey, you know. And so he's over there, and he is really feeling like the stuff. And fellas, that can happen to you when you got the attention of a pretty girl. You just think you can do anything. And there's 30 Philistines there, and he says, I'm going to give you a riddle. And if you can answer me that riddle, I'm going to buy each of you a new set of clothes. But if you can't, I want each of you to get me a new set of clothes. They said, well, what's the riddle? He said, out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. Well, they didn't have any idea what he was talking about. He's talking about that lion, see, that he came in, the honey he got out of it. Well, that went on, and they came to him, and while he was gone, they went over to his girlfriend, and they told him, said, you got to find out that riddle for us. And she pulled one of the oldest tricks in the books. She went to Samson, and she pouted, and she said, you haven't told me the answer to your riddle. If you loved me, if you really loved me, you would tell me that. And fellas, don't ever pay attention to that, okay? If you really loved me, you'd do something you shouldn't do, is what she's saying. And so, tell me the answer to that riddle. And dumb old Sam, he told her about that lion. And then she went and told those fellas. And when the day came for the riddle, they told him what it was. He said this. He said, you have plowed with my heifer. That's what he thought of her right then. He said, you plowed with my heifer. And he was so mad, and he went out, and I'll tell you how he got the 30 garments. He went out and killed 30 Philistines and took their clothes and gave them to those fellas, and he stomped off home, and then he didn't show up for a while. And that girl's father said, well, he's not going to come. I'll give her to another man. And he married away, and then Samson, he got to missing her, and he goes back, and she's already married to another fella. Well, he is mad now. And his dad said, well, take her younger sister. He didn't want her younger sister. That's who he wanted. So here's how he got revenge. He went out and caught 300 foxes. And he tied their tails together and lit a firebrand between their tails, and I guess it's like cats. You can imagine tying cat tails together, those foxes. They're both trying to run away from that fire, and they're just running all over. And he threw them out in the fields, and they went out there where they're and it all burned up. And those Philistines, boy, they're coming after Samson. They were so mad, they went to the fellow's going to be his father, they went to his house and burned that house down and burnt that girl with them in that house. And then Samson went out, and it said he got into a fight, and it said he smote them hip and thigh. Well, they were so upset. After that, he went out and set up on a big old rock. They were mad down at Samson. So they get back at him and they tell the Israelites, says, you deliver Samson to us. So they go up there and say, Samson, we got to take you to the Philistines. We're going to have to bind you and take you to the Philistines. He said, as long as you don't hurt me yourself, I'll let you do it. So they got these ropes and they tied Samson up. And they took him to the Philistines. And when the Philistines got there, he just took those ropes and pop! He broke them right off his hands, and he looked around, and there's the jawbone of a donkey laying down there, and that's his weapon. And he took that, and against those Philistines, he used that as his weapon until he slew. It says he just piled them up in heaps. And then he was thirsty, and he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord gave him water to drink right out of the jawbone of that donkey. And he threw that down and went home. Now, that's the kind of fella Samson was. He had another girlfriend in the city of Gath, and she was an evil woman. He went to her one night, and they said, we've got him now. And so they shut the gates of the city to lock him up in the city. And Samson got up, and he started home, and there the gates are locked. You think locked gates going to stop Samson? I'll tell you what he did. He went over there, and he grabbed those gates, and he lifted them right up off of their hinges and put them on his shoulders and marched up and set them down at the top of the hill and walked home. Well, he had another girlfriend, and she was just as bad as all the others. Her name was Delilah, and they promised her 30,000 pieces of silver, something, a great big rich amount, if she could find out the secret of his strength. And he teased her for a long time, but finally Samson gave in and told her it was his hair. And so while he was asleep, she went over there and cut his hair off. And then when he woke up, the Philistines came in, and she said, "The Philistines are on you, Samson." And he couldn't fight them. He'd lost his strength because he'd cut his hair. And they bound him up, and then they put his eyes out so he couldn't see. And they took him down to the mill, and he had to work like a bird and the beast, grinding at the mill. Well, they had a big feast day, the Philistines did. And it had been some time past while he's down there at the mill grinding. And I'll tell you what, while he was down there grinding, his hair grew back. And during that great feast day, they came to get Samson to make sport of him. And they brought him to their great big temple. And the little boy that brought him up there, Samson says, "Can you help me find the pillars of this temple so I can lean on them?" And the little boy helped his hands find the two great pillars to the temple. And with a mighty heave, he pushed those two pillars over, and the roof of the temple came tumbling down, and it killed Samson. But on his way out, he took the lives of 3,000 Philistines. Well, we come to the latter part of the book of Judges, and we read something in Judges 17:6 and 21:25. The verses are almost identical. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." Listen, they weren't even doing what God said. And as you read through this section, it's really one of the most troubling sections to me of the Bible to read, to see how degraded that nation of Israel had become. Now, out of all this confusion and sin and wrong things and this decrepit society, there's still some good folks. And you read about them in the book of Ruth. Let me tell you real quickly the story of Ruth. It's a romance story. It's about a younger lady that actually proposes to an older man. And here's how that came about. There's this lady named Naomi. And there's a famine in the land. Now, they lived in the little town of Bethlehem, the place where Jesus would later be born. But years before that, Naomi and her husband lived there with their two sons. And to get away from the famine, they moved down to the land of Moab. And while they were down there, her two sons found these Moabitish women and married them. But after that, her husband dies. And then her two sons die. And Naomi is left with her two daughters-in-law. This wasn't what she had planned. The famine had left, and she decided she'd go back home to Bethlehem. And on the way, the daughters-in-law were going with her, but she sent them back home. And one went. But Ruth said this in Ruth 1, verses 16 and 17. "Entreat me not to leave thee, nor to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And whither thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." That was the dedication Ruth had toward her mother-in-law. You may not know this, but Lori's name is Ruth. It's Lori, Ruth, real. That was the girl that I dated, and I will never forget that day she was dressed in that wedding gown, looking up at me and repeating those words during our wedding. But to me, they're some of the sweetest words in the Bible. And she was saying that to me as proposing her love toward me during that wedding. Well, Ruth goes with her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law shows up in Bethlehem, and her old friends recognize her and say, "Look, isn't that Naomi?" And Naomi, now, things hadn't worked out good for her. She said, "Don't call me Naomi." Now, Naomi means pleasantness. But she was not pleasant. She was a bitter woman. She said, "Call me Mara." And the name Mara means bitter. Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. She said, "The Lord has dealt bitterly with me." Well, that's who Ruth is having to look after and take care of. And she goes out, and here's why it's so important to read all those old laws, because it explains what's going on when you read this. Ruth went out to glean in the fields, and that's covered in the old laws. So you read the old laws, you kind of understand what's going on in the story. Ruth goes out to glean in the fields, and she's gleaning in the fields of Boaz. And Boaz spots her. She's not like the other ladies there. And he inquires about her, and they tell her who he is, and Boaz shows her special favor. And Ruth doesn't understand, why is he showing me this special favor? Look, it wasn't because Ruth was a young, good-looking woman. That's not the reason. This is what Boaz says. Boaz said, and Ruth 2:11-12 answered her and said, It hath been fully showed me all that thou hast done to thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come into a people which thou knewest not heretofore. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given to thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. I tell you, Boaz saw this woman is special, and the thing that stood out to Boaz was she was such a good woman in the way she's taking care of her mother-in-law. Well, she goes home loaded with all this grain, and Naomi says, how come you have so much grain today? And she says, well, she explains what happens to Boaz. Now, Naomi knows Boaz. In fact, Boaz is a kinsman. And as a kinsman, he could marry Ruth and take care of them. And so Naomi gets this plan. She says, Ruth, here's what I want you to do. And so Ruth does what her mother-in-law tells her. And when they were threshing wheat, she goes up when Boaz is out there alone, and while she uncovers his feet. He's asleep, and she uncovers his feet, and she lays down in his feet. Well, something got Boaz. He woke up, and there's a woman at my feet. And he finds out what it is, and she said something very strange. She said, spread thy skirt over me. Now, the word she used is the same words Boaz had used when he said, the Lord under whose wings thou art come to trust. It's the same words, only it's translated a little different. What she's saying is, look, you tell me to come under the Lord's wings, you cover me with your wings. You take care of me. She's proposing to him. And Boaz decides, I'm going to take her up on that. But there's a nearer kinsman, and I've got to redeem her from that nearer kinsman. So the next day, he sends her out with some grain, gets out before the sun comes up. I don't want it known that a woman's been here. And that protects their characters, you see. And then the next day, he goes to this nearer kinsman, and he works with the elders at the gate. And again, if you read the law, you kind of understand what's happening with the shoes and everything. But Boaz marries Ruth, and he becomes the redeemer kinsman of Ruth and Mara, they call her. But then here's how the story ends in Ruth 4:13-17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left me this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel, and he shall be to thee a restorer of thy life. What's that mean? They put this little baby in the hands of Naomi and says, he'll restore your life. She had a reason to live now. She had something to live for. She had a grandbaby to look after, you see. And then look how cute this thing goes. He'll be a nurser of thine own age, for thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse to it. And her women and neighbors gave it a saying, there's a son born to Naomi. Why, Naomi took that little baby Obed and took some, it's just like that. You know, Ruth bore that child, but look, it's a son born to Naomi. It was like her own son. And it did. It gave her a reason to live. Now, why is that story in there? Right at the last verses of the book of Ruth, you find this. Now, these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez beget Hezron. And Hezron beget Ram, and Ram beget Amminadab, and Amminadab beget Nahshon, and Nahshon beget Solomon, and Solomon beget Boaz, and Boaz beget Obed, see that's of Ruth, and Obed beget Jesse, and Jesse beget David. You remember Pharez? Abraham, through thy seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we find out that's Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and Judah gives birth to Pharez. We're going to read a little bit later over in 1 and 2 Samuel about David the king. And God promises David that you'll have a son and he'll rule over a kingdom and his kingdom will be forever. It's a fulfillment of that promise. And then we start talking about Moses and Joshua and all these judges, and we're away from that line, but the story of Ruth ties it together. It ties the book of Genesis to the book of 1 Samuel, and you see the genealogical connection now that runs right through Boaz and Ruth that links up the promise from Abraham to David, and then we're going to read from David all the way to Jesus. And we'll start back on that line again. And you see, the reason that's so important is because the promise, through thy seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And remember, read it like a mystery looking for clues. The book of Ruth is the clue. Now you're back on the trail. And you know what to read. And you're looking for the clues. And you're going to follow this all the way through. The New Testament opens up the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And the story of Ruth makes the connection and brings the line all together. Isn't that a fascinating story? I tell you, just going over this makes me want to read every word of that over again. And even though some parts are kind of hard to read it to get an awareness, and then you'll find some parts more interesting and you want to dwell on that even more. But don't forget that in all this story, we are the heirs of that promise. If we will believe and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, all the spiritual blessings promised are going to be our own. And with that, I want to extend the invitation as we stand and sing this song.